You're listening to the podcast series, Introducing the Tanakh, with Brooke Lester. This episode is Emergence, Part B, 3 Proposals and Current Discussion. The 3 different proposals regarding the emergence of the people Israel in the land of Canaan, I'll label as first, the rapid conquest model, second, the gradual infiltration model, and third, the revolting peasants model. Beginning then with the rapid conquest model. This view of the emergence of the people in the land is associated with scholars Albright, A-L-B-R-I-G-H-T, and later with G.E. Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. In this view, basically, Joshua 1 through 12 is privileged as a source of information about the entry of the people into the land. And Judges 1 is read as an occasional retaking of sites that had been taken before. You'll remember that this is the view offered by the Deuteronomistic historian himself in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. There's the view of Joshua 1 through 12 with the unmitigated success of 12 tribes united under Joshua, taking all of the land in 3 major pushes, central, southern, and northern. And then there is the view of Judges 1 that shows the same taking of the land, but at the hands of individual tribes not working together and not meeting with a great deal of success in driving out or killing all of the inhabitants. And the Deuteronomistic historian, in weaving these 2 accounts together, harmonizes them in chapter 2, 1 through 5, by saying that the stories of Judges 1 amount in effect to a later retaking of the sites. But you'll remember that this creates a very difficult split between the end of Joshua 24 and Joshua chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, where apparently a single narrative has been split, with Joshua dismissing the people at the end of Joshua 24, and the people being dismissed and going their separate ways in Joshua 2, 6 through 8. That single narrative has been split open, and Judges 1 sort of dropped into the middle of it, creating embarrassing things like whether Joshua is dead or alive during that time, looking, for example, at Judges 1, verse 1. But the rapid conquest view takes that view more or less uncritically, and also depends largely upon destruction layers at Bethel, Lachish, and Hatzor. It finds burn layers at these sites where the towns have been burned. They've been conquered by an enemy and burned. And these sites can be placed near enough into the 13th or 12th century that this view would want to look at these burned sites and say, Joshua and his 12 tribes were here. A few difficulties with this view. One, that Joshua 1 through 12 does not say that Joshua burnt all the towns. Chapter 11, verse 13 says that Israel burned none of the towns that stood on mounds except Hatzor, which Joshua did burn. Earlier in 8, it does say that Joshua burned Ai, the city of Ai, and also in Joshua 2 and 6, Jericho is apparently burned. So that leaves this theory with burn evidence at Bethel and Lachish that it wants to attribute to the activity of Joshua 1 through 12 against the evidence of Joshua 1 through 12 that does not say that it burned those sites. Furthermore, regarding Bethel, a city that the rapid conquest model depends upon, it's the destruction layers at Bethel, Lachish, and Hatzor that can be dated to the period that it wants to be dating them. Bethel is not mentioned at all in Joshua 1 through 12. It's rather the neighboring city of Ai, that is, it's spelled A-I, the neighboring city of Ai occupies a prominent place in the narrative of Joshua 1 through 12. So what does the rapid conquest model do about the fact that it depends upon a destruction layer at Bethel to say Joshua was here, but that Bethel is not mentioned in Joshua 1 through 12? Well, this model points to the fact that the neighboring city of Ai spelled Ai, is right next to Bethel, and that Ai is mentioned in Joshua 1 through 12. It has a prominent place in that narrative. And it proposes that the writers of the biblical text simply forgot that it was really the city of Bethel that should be described in Joshua 1 through 12, and that Ai is described accidentally. So all of the narrative about the city of Ai really should be about the city of Bethel, which was destroyed in the 12th century BCE. This solution by the rapid conquest model runs into even deeper trouble because the archaeological evidence is that the city of Ai was unoccupied from the 24th to the 12th centuries. That's for 1,200 years. That is, if we're imagining a 12th century Joshua come riding in with his 12 tribes, there is in the city of Ai nobody to conquer. One rather ingenious attempt at resolving this difficulty by the rapid conquest model is the proposal that this pair of cities, Bethel and Ai, that the population sort of skipped back and forth from time to time from one city to another. That is, if they were in Bethel and it were destroyed or ridden by plague, everybody would move over to Ai until something bad happened in Ai, and then they would move back to Bethel. And in this, you would have papers written that would show pairs of city-states all over the land of Canaan in which it's proposed there was sort of this flea-hopping back and forth between these pairs of cities. An ingenious solution to this problem, the only difficulty being that we have not the slightest piece of evidence that this sort of hopping back and forth between paired sites ever happened. A related difficulty to that of Ai is that of Jericho. The walls of Jericho, according to the archaeological evidence, had been in ruins ever since the 6th century BCE and would be in ruins for many centuries after the 12th century. In fact, through the rest of the biblical period, the Old Testament biblical period. Now, archaeologists can differ about 40 years here and 70 years there, but 4 centuries don't go missing anywhere in the archaeological record. And with the walls of Jericho in ruins from the 16th century forward, there are no walls to come a-tumbling down, as we have in Joshua 2 and 6. Finally, this view of tribes of Israelites rampaging out of the wilderness and breaking like waves upon the settlements of Canaan depends upon and presupposes a rather outmoded view of nomadism, and especially Arabic camel nomadism. If you've ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, you know this view that's in mind. That is, there's this idea of desert camel nomads that are always breaking like waves upon the settlements of settled people because they want that settled land. They envy the fruits of civilization and they want to come in and take them. A couple of problems with this. One is that there's no evidence that this kind of desert camel nomadism was employed by the tribes of Israel. It's certainly not the kind of lifestyle presupposed in the Book of Judges. In the Book of Judges, you have agricultural people who seem always to have been agricultural people. And even in our relatively modern times, these desert-dwelling Arab camel-riding nomads do not seem to be trying to get out of the desert and live in these settled lands, but have adapted to life in the desert and are not trying to they're not envying the fruits of civilization in the way imagined by the rapid conquest model. The shortcomings of the rapid conquest model led folks to begin to consider another model, one of gradual infiltration. This is associated with Albrecht Alt, A-L-T, and Martin Note, N-O-N-T, although their proposals differ from one another in an important respect, as we'll see. This view imagines different groups infiltrating gradually into the hills over many generations, over a long period of time, even down to the time of David, more or less 1000 BCE. Independent tribes of donkey nomads that live on the fringes of civilization move into the sparsely settled hill country in search of pasture. Remember our rapid settlement into the hill country during the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. And they have little conflict with Canaanites during this time because there's not very many people living in the hills for them to displace. So there's relatively little violence and no violence down in the plains and the flatlands. only when this hill country, this hill population with their diverse origins grew in size and united to the point where that they were moving down into the flatlands, only there would you have conflict with those populations. Now this model, the gradual infiltration model, would do a good job of explaining the relative representations of hill sites and lowlands in Joshua 1 through 12. You'll remember I said before that in Joshua 1 through 12, the sites that we get are mostly those of the flatlands, the plains, the beaches, the passes down below, not of the sites in the hill country. This model would claim that what Joshua 1 through 12 in its 7th century context is remembering are the clashes and violence that took place when the people of the hill country who had already been settled there for a considerable period of time, gradually having infiltrated that hill country, only when they moved down into the flatlands and had conflicts with those flatlands neighbors. Those are the conflicts that are remembered by Joshua 1 through 12 and interpreted in its 7th century time as the story of the emergence of the entry of the people into the land. That is, a group that has diverse origins over a long period of time, different tribes independent of one another, gradually infiltrating the hills. Only when they have become something of a united people do they move down into those flatlands. And that's why Joshua 1 through 12 remembers it as a united conquest. Another positive character of the gradual infiltration model is that it explains the ideological character of much of Joshua 2 through 8, which is a part of that, of course, of that Joshua 1 through 12 piece. I said in the first part of this episode that much of Joshua 1 through 12, and I'm looking especially at Joshua 2 through 8, has an ideological character. It's local stories, mostly Gilgal-centric, mostly around Gilgal, explaining particular features of what they see around them. The ruins of the walls of... Why are the walls of Jericho in ruins? Why are there a pile of stones at this particular location? Why are the Canaanites still dwelling among us? Why? In this view, these are the preserved stories of individual tribes that are only at a late stage brought together into the Deuteronomistic narrative and represented as the experience of all Israel. An important difference between Alt and Note is that for Alt, these tribes were immigrants. They were coming in from far away. And for example, one group, for instance, might have been an Out of Egypt group whose story involved an exodus from Egypt under the hand of Yahweh. Another group might have identified itself with an ancestor Abraham, and perhaps another group with an ancestor Isaac or Jacob. Yet another group would focus its identity around its experience in the wilderness and the saving activity of its God in preserving that tribe, that people, in the wilderness. And only over time, perhaps through the shared worship of Yahweh at a central shrine, would this group hammer out a shared identity in which all of the groups adopted the memories and perspectives of the other groups into one single narrative, a narrative of a people who had shared all of these experiences. In another episode of this series concerning the Pentateuch, I will have looked at tradition history criticism and the major Pentateuchal traditions. Martin Note's view is very similar and compatible to Alt, with the exception that for Note, for the most part, this people Israel is a part of the indigenous population. What we're looking at is the sedentarization of local pastoralists. Local pastoralists are becoming sedentary. They had been pastoral nomads and are now settling down into agricultural communities in the hills. But again, that we're talking about a local origin for the greatest part of the people Israel. This jibes with a piece of evidence that's of the greatest importance that I don't discuss on the first side, in part because I'm not really sure where to put it. But there's this basic piece of evidence that is the language of Biblical Hebrew. The language of Biblical Hebrew is a language that is exceedingly closely related to the language as it is preserved of Moab, of Ammon, of Edom, of the entirety of this area, so close that we can speak of biblical Hebrew and Moabite and Ammonite and Edomite as being dialects of a single language. So much so that these neighboring languages are sometimes called the Hebrew languages or the Hebrew dialects. And there is not in biblical Hebrew the kind of substrata or superstrata that would be associated with a language of a people who are coming from somewhere far away, or even of a people of originally local origin who had been far away for a long time. I'm thinking especially of, for example, an Egyptian substratum or superstratum. The linguistic evidence points uniformly and singly at a local origin for the people Israel, as Note would have it in his version of the gradual infiltration model. That is, for Note, the people who are infiltrating these hills, the people who are rapidly settling into this hill country, are moving in from very nearby. They are the pastoralists who originally down in the flatlands lived on the margins of the settled states. Certainly the gradual infiltration model goes a long way towards solving the problems of the rapid conquest model and seems to do overall a better job of dealing with both the biblical and extra-biblical evidence. A few difficulties. For example, it's noted by some that the depiction of the Israelite tribes as pastoral nomads, these pastoral nomads on the edges of the Canaanite city-states that eventually move up into the hills, is hard to support biblically only insofar as the book of Judges, again, uniformly describes this as an agricultural economy. The tribes have an agricultural economy, and they seem only to have ever had an agricultural economy. One way that later versions of the gradual infiltration model have solved that is to look at this business of pastoral nomads, at these nomads living on the fringes of the civilized city-states, and suggesting that what we may be looking at there is something more like semi-nomads. That is, a group of people who are agricultural during certain parts of the year that lend itself to agriculture, and are nomadic or locally nomadic, a limited nomadism during the parts of the year where they're not doing agriculture. This would explain why we have these so-called semi-nomads or pastoral nomads who, when they move up into the hills and settle there and settle down into a purely agrarian economy, already have the language, the tools, the tradition, the experience of an agricultural society. Finally, there's the model called the revolting peasants model, associated with Mendenhall and Gottwald. This model can be in many ways seen as an adaptation of or extension of the gradual infiltration model. Not so much an alternative of it, but perhaps a branch, not so much an alternative to it, as perhaps a branch of it. The narrative of the revolting peasants model is that what the Bible remembers as the conquest of Canaan was essentially an uprising among the Canaanite population, specifically of the lower classes, the marginalized classes, against the higher classes, against the hierarchy, against the rulers. In this view, this conquest, this uprising, is triggered by the liberating Yahweh faith of an incoming Exodus group. We can imagine maybe just a single tribe, a small group that experienced what they remember as an exodus from Egypt by the hand of Yahweh. And when they come and tell their story of this egalitarian Yahweh religion, this sparks an uprising among the oppressed working class, so to speak, of Canaanites in the city-states. This originally small Yahweh-worshipping population swells greatly with Canaanite converts. That is, these Canaanites convert en masse to Yahweh religion. Perhaps we can imagine here, in the view of the revolting peasants model, these malcontent apiru elements that we saw in the Amarna letters. If you've got all these displaced, non-property owning bandit classes, they would be inclined to join in, to throw their hand in with this revolution against the rulers, against the city-states. So this view is basically that of social conflict between the hierarchical city-states of the plains and passes and the heavily taxed hillside villages. The rulers of these city-states are closely associated with the Egyptians. It's through the rulers of these city-states that the Egyptians maintain their hegemony over the people of Canaan. And it's presumed that these hierarchical rulers enjoy the fruits of this collaboration with Egypt in the form of conspicuous consumption. For these revolting peasants, it's the egalitarian love of Yahweh that prompts their dissociation from these from this hierarchical system, causing them to flee to the hills and create a more egalitarian Yahweh-worshipping society in those hills. And this, for the revolting peasant model, accounts for the rapid settlement in the hills, in the rapid settlement of the hills in the 12th century BCE. The revolting peasant model has the benefit of explaining, for example, why some Canaanite populations are depicted in the biblical texts as colluding with the Israelites. We can think of Rahab in Joshua 2 and 6, or the Gibeonites in Joshua 9 and 10. This view of Yahweh religion at this time as being essentially egalitarian in character may be thought to gain some support from, for example, the legal code of Exodus 20 to 23. In this legal code, those who are addressed are basically Israelites who are all of more or less the same social class. It's imagined that everybody is agricultural. Everybody has a farm. Everyone's working the farm. That's what everyone does. There is not, for example, in Exodus 20 to 23, some ruling class, no monarchy, for example, no priestly theocracy, no ruling class of that kind, just a bunch of farming Israelites who have to find out how to get along with one another under Yahweh. That said, a close reading of that law code shows that it's not so much that everybody's the same, but it's just simply that everyone who is addressed is the same. The legal code of Exodus 20 to 23 is addressed to those persons who have freedom of choice in that society and who are the major part of the economy. That is, the propertied Israelite male head of household. The law code is addressed to the heads of households who own property, but that doesn't mean that those are the only people who exist in the land of Israel. So, for example, much of that legal code concerns the slavery of other Israelites. A major theme in that legal code, and certainly a less than egalitarian element of it. The rapid conquest model may have the benefit of explaining some architectural features that are pointed out. So, for instance, remember our four-room houses that are predominant in the hill country. These are small houses with pillars separating the rooms for the most part. These are over against, for example, what are seen to be large footprint construction in the plains country. You've got these very large, complex buildings with many rooms and inner rooms that can only be reached through other rooms. And the revolting peasant model looks at this and says, down in the plains we have palaces, palatial estates occupied by this ruling class with their conspicuous consumption supported by collaboration with the Egyptian overlords. Whereas up in the hill country, we have these small footprint houses, these four-room houses for small families, each of which are more or less identical one to another in terms of their relative prosperity. Again, against this, it can be pointed out that we don't really know what those large footprint complexes are down in the plains. They may be palaces, they may be large public buildings like city halls. They may be they may be complex warehouses. Remember that in the hills, in the flatlands below, we're talking about a centralized urban society, city-states. This does imply a hierarchy and the kinds of large buildings that would go along with the management of an urban environment and economy. Whereas up in the hills, you can't build a large footprint building in the hills because you're building on a slope. It would fall down the hill. Up in the mountains, you need to be building relatively small footprint structures because that's all you've got to work with. And finally, it must be conceded that the narratives of Rachel and the Gibeonites notwithstanding, no such wide-scale social revolt is depicted in any biblical narrative. So again, we're looking at a model that would imagine, as really with all of these, including the rapid conquest, a picture that doesn't ultimately jibe with every aspect of the biblical narrative, but rather seeks to imagine what sort of events happened in history that might give rise to a narrative like we find in the Bible. But Revolting Peasants certainly has a difficulty with that because we just don't find that kind of social revolt explicitly in any of the biblical narrative. The hypothesis does not find itself able to reckon with the destruction layers that do exist in the hills in the 13th and 12th centuries. And finally, the theory is guilty of what some would argue is a gross anachronism with regard to religious conversion. Remember, in this model, the Canaanites throw their lot in with Yahweh worship en masse, converting to the religion of Yahweh. But we don't find in the ancient world conversion from one religion to another. One's religious identity is entirely bound up with one's ethnicity, with one's state. Religious identity is not conceived of as a matter of choice in the ancient Near East, and we simply don't find this kind of individual religious conversion that is imagined in the Revolting Peasants model. These days, I think it can be fairly said that nearly all critical approaches to the emergence of the people in the land rely on some form of the gradual infiltration model. That is, the gradual infiltration model is most successful in dealing with the biblical and extra-biblical evidence, and it's where it has difficulty that the work has been done in the meantime to try to hammer out a full theory. So what kinds of discussions are going on toward that end in these days? Well, the social scientific approaches tend to dominate. That is, you've got people trying to hammer out what kinds of nomadism are there and have there been. What is a nomad? What is a pastoral nomad? What is a semi-nomad? This, of course, trying to go at the gradual infiltrations models, imagining that the people were once some kind of nomads on the fringes of the local populations, the local city-state populations, who move up into the hill country and take up agriculture full time. So, what kind of nomadism do we imagine can fit into that sort of a narrative? Climate change is something that folks look at. There has been climate change and was climate change in the ancient Near East, both natural and apparently man-influenced through the cutting down of vast swaths of forest and such. And how does this give rise to changes in strategies for survival? These are people who are looking at things like the terraced farming in the hills or the digging of cisterns. How can this be? Are these markers of ethnicity that people are bringing with them from far away? As some would argue, saying that, here are the Israelites. Wherever we see terraced hills and dug plastered cisterns and four-room houses and collard-rim jars, there we see what the Israelites have brought in with them from far away. And social science asks, rather, can these be seen as coping strategies that would be simply taken up by the local population in response to changes in climate or just moving up into the hill countries from the flatlands? Pig bones, right? The Bible represents the people Israel as avoiding pork. So where we find pig bones in the trash cans of ancient peoples, or where we don't find pig bones in the trash cans of ancient peoples, does this help us narrow in on where we might think we see Israelites? Hopefully this episode gives you some idea of what it means in biblical studies to be working with evidence and to be trying to put together a narrative representation of historical events that deals as best you can with the evidence and acknowledging where one's reconstruction is challenged by the evidence at hand. Thank you for holding onto your hat and racing with me through this episode on the emergence of the people Israel in the land. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope you will listen to other episodes in the series introducing the Tanakh. Thank you again for listening.